Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Viewers, welcome to Auliya Council's Mukalma series. This is Mehdi Kazmi again from New York. Today, I'm honored to have as our guest Dr. Rachana Umashankar. She's an associate professor at INO University here in New York of religious studies, and she specializes in Sufi studies. She hails from India and is very much part of our Auliya Council members and supporters and our regular speakers. Today, we are going to speak about Vajd. Rachna is going to enlighten us on the role of Vajd in or religious or spiritual ecstasy in various Indian traditions, particularly the Chishti traditions. Vajd or religious ecstasy, as you know, from time immemorial, has been part of the human quest for closeness to God or the deity or the higher being, and it has been used in various shapes and forms. It is a very natural state of being, or a state where one is closer to God, and there are various methods that people have used across traditions all over the West, in the Indian tradition in particular, right from meditation to to ecstasy induced or accompanied by music and so on. So Rachna, if you could tell us a bit about the state of ecstasy or Vajd, we can start from there.
Sure. So to be able to explain the idea of Wajd, I need to step back a few paces and discuss the concept of fana. Um, and so, in as you rightly say, in not just in Sufism, but in many spiritual and mystical traditions around the world, there is a concept of union with the divine, union with the higher power, oneness with the higher power. And the idea there is that we as human beings operate in in a state of isolation, in a way. Right? We are these self-contained bags of skin and flesh and blood and bones, and we have a very distinct notion of the self. I am distinct from you. You are distinct from her. She is distinct from him. So there is a sense of distinction, of separation, of self from the other, and a sense of us being individuated, individual, isolated entities in a way. And the many spiritual and mystical traditions around the world talk about how this state of being is not necessarily a reflection of the full reality of truth with a capital T. That the true state of being is one of union and communion rather than a state of isolation and separation. And the ultimate state of feeling that oneness, that union, is described in slightly different ways in different religious traditions. So in Islam, for example, it would be described as oneness with God, union with God. In the Buddhist tradition, it might be described as becoming one with everything, right? Becoming one with the fabric of reality. So this idea is described in different ways in different religious traditions, but at the core of it is the notion of the elimination of separation, of distinction, of a distinct self, and the desire to be in union, with a larger power, a higher power. So that is something that's a very important concept in Sufism as well. And in Sufism, the one thing that is identified as preventing the human being from achieving that state of oneness is the ego, is that sense of self, that distinct self. And that sense of distinct self is seen as a barrier that prevents us from perceiving ourselves as being one with God. So when I explain this to my students, I explain it as if you imagine a bubble, the what is inside the bubble is air, what is outside the bubble is air, and what separates it, the air inside and the air outside, is a thin film of soapy water. So you can imagine the ego as that barrier. And once the ego pops, like the bubble pops, then there is no self. There is only the divine, right? There is no bubble anymore. There is only the air, right? So that would be an analogy for how the ego prevents us from experiencing ourselves as fully present within the divine, in a way, within the embrace of the divine, if you will. So that annihilation, that destruction of the ego, is what is known as fana. So fana, it just means annihilation. It means destruction. It refers to the annihilation of the ego, which then results in the experience of union or oneness with God. Now, having explained that, the ultimate goal of a Sufi practitioner is, of course, a permanent state of that, of oneness with the divine. And that is known as baqa, right? Baqa is the state of sustenance or permanence within the divine that is achieved after one experiences the ego death. Yeah. So the ego, once the ego barrier is destroyed, once fana is achieved, the next, what results from that is baqa. But that is a permanent state. But the spiritual or the mystical journey, it's a journey. It's not a switch that you turn on or off. And these meditation practices like zikr and sama in Sufism are all geared towards allowing the Sufi practitioner to travel that journey towards oneness with God. And as the practitioner gets more into the zone when they are in those meditative rituals, right? When they get in the zone, in that sort of fully focused, immersive state, through zikr or sama, then it is possible for the Sufi practitioner to have a brief experience of oneness with God, to briefly experience if not the annihilation, then the diminution, the reduction of the ego, so that one gets a glimpse of what it feels like to be one with the divine. And it is that sometimes momentary experience of oneness with the divine in these meditative states that we call wajad. And because that experience of oneness with divine, as temporary as it is still often experienced as euphoric, blissful, ecstatic, right? Where one ceases to experience fear in any form and feels completely encased in love and security, right? And that feeling of complete assuredness, of feeling completely secure and taken care of, is an experience of complete bliss, and something we don't experience in normal life, right? So at kind of a way to explain wajad then is a brief experience, a temporary experience of fana, if not in its complete sense, but at least in some partial way, right?
Right.
So I will stop there because I can keep rambling. So if you would like to ask
So,
a follow-up question about that.
sure. No, thank you so much. Uh, so people have looked at it in certain manners, right? So it's been described as a merger of the self in some
Mm,
ways. In some, it is, a complete gharq in another being, right? To
mhm,
God, and then not feeling anything. So from a I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a neurologist. So it is a state, in our terms, of complete sensory, complete absence of all stimuli, whether they're internal emotional stimuli or external sensory stimuli, and that creates this space within oneself. Don't want to call it self, because it is by definition the absence of self,
absolutely. Mhm,
but it is that space in which you experience what is said to be the experience or of the divine, or closeness, or merger, right?
mhm.
When those ego boundaries are completely absent. So could you tell us, in the subcontinental tradition, what are the various forms of wajd, or the methods that are used to get into that state?
Yeah. So in terms of what you say, sort of the absence of stimuli, the absence of feeling, I do want to point out that our audience shouldn't think that it's a state of numbness in any way. It's not by any measure considered to be a state of non-feeling or numbness. Um, if anything, you use the word gharq, right? The drowning of the self, right, within the divine. If anything, it is a complete, like it. It's not numbness, but rather one's anxieties, one's fears, one's sense of insecurity, one's sense of being untethered, homeless, unmoored, without purpose, etc. All of those feelings getting washed away, if you will,
Correct.
by the experience of sort of being sort of drowning in this sort of whatever name you would like to call this, right, this entity,
One.
this power, right. So I just wanted to, for the sake of the audience, to clarify that it's not like an anesthetized person.
Correct.
It's not a state of numbness in
It,
that
it is
sense.
it is a different state of feeling and
Yeah.
being, which is only that one thing that fana completely. You
Right.
feel that intensely. I mean,
Yeah.
I feel it. When I'm in my
Yes.
when I'm at the height of my uh, uh, that state during summer,
Yeah.
um, and it is really triggered off by certain poetry or certain
Yes.
musical
Yes.
constructions. It happens. So
Yeah. Hmm. So that leads me to answering the second part of your question about it, what it looks like, or what triggers it, or what the setting for it is in the South Asian context. And you specifically asked about Chishtiya Sufism, so I'll discuss that. In the Chishti Sufi, no, the ritual of Sama is again found in Sufi traditions all over the world, but they look very different. They sound very different. But at a fundamental level, sama, the word sama is from the Arabic word listening. And so the idea of sama is that it is a meditative ritual in which the practitioner uh, enters a meditative state by riding the wave of some kind of sound. Now, that sound could be music, that sound could be poetry that is recited, it could be song sung, it could just be rhythmic drumming, it could be chanting. Different cultures around the world have adapted sama in different ways. But at the core of it, it's the idea that you lose yourself into the sound and you allow the sound to then carry you into that state, hopefully, of ecstasy. And in South Asian Sufi traditions, particularly in Chishtiya Sufism, it is ecstatic declarations of love that are hoped, that is hoped will induce wajd in the listener. And the that is this. So there are two things that are important to understand about this. One is that in Sufism, not just in Chishti Sufism, a great deal of emphasis is, and your audience may be familiar with this, a great deal of emphasis is placed on the idea of cultivating unquestioning, passionate love for God. And the point is that if there is anything that has the capacity to diminish the ego, it is love. And love, a giving love, a selfless love, has the capacity to make us forget about ourselves and to think only of the beloved. Right? So anyone who has experienced romantic love knows what I'm talking about. Knows, anyone who has been madly in love in a human form knows what it is like to feel a loss of self in the love of someone else. We know that experience intimately. And so the metaphor of romantic love, it's not just a metaphor though. It's a metaphor as well as a tool. It's a metaphor in that the beloved is the divine in these poems, in these songs, and the lover is the Sufi practitioner. So in that sense, it's a metaphor for the love of God. But it's also a tool, because the hope is that when you listen to these romantic verses composed in these, very particular ragas, that they induce in the listener a sympathetic response. That is, when you're listening to these songs of romantic love, not only is it a metaphor, not only is it a literary construction, that not only is it an analogy for love of God, but rather, but more than that, when one listens to these words of selfless love for the beloved, when listens to these songs sung in particular ragas, that it allows one to put oneself in the shoes of the lover who is speaking through the songs. Right. So when
gathering,
when you listen to the songs where the singer is talking about Rangrez, like dye me in your colors, right? You have the capacity to place yourself in the position of that selfless lover, expressing that kind of selfless love to their beloved. And in so doing, in being able to listen with that kind of sympathy and empathy for the lover, it softens your ego. And then that has the capacity, if you have a spiritual sort of inclination, it has the capacity to then open you up not just to the love of a human beloved, but to the love of the divine. Right? So it's a way of opening the door. So the Sama ritual is a tool for opening that door to, or creating a crack in the ego. And through repeated practice, as with any kind of meditation, with repeated practice, that little crack in the ego can get bigger and bigger and bigger. And
Mhm.
eventually the wall
Right.
crumbles, right? Eventually the barrier itself is gone.
Right.
And so the Sama ritual is a tool, right? It is a tool for that achievement of Wajd. And eventually, there are stories of many Sufi saints who have achieved fana during Sama, right? Not just Wajd, but fana. So, for
True.
example, I think Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki famously
Auliya
achieved
Kaki
fana
Shah,
while
जी,
listening to a couplet,
ये particular
uh,
verse, जी,
Kushtegan-e-Khanjare,
ये
I forget the
तस्लीम
rest
पर,
of the verse. That Taslim Raw. That's the one, right? So that is so one must see these Sama rituals as tools to push the the person with the spiritual heart, if you will, forward on the journey. And of course, you know, this is you mentioned other religious traditions where this is employed, and of course in the South Asian context, when Chishtiya Sufism developed and sort of the Qawwali form developed in the Chishtiya Sufi order as kind of the preferred form of Sama, the it is but natural that the musical traditions of India were part of that process. And so these qawwalis are sung in particular ragas. They're often ragas that are part of their night ragas, evening ragas, and evening and night ragas are very sensual, very romantic. They are part of those of the audience members who are familiar with the idea of rasa, different moods of
right.
ragas. The evening and the night ragas tend to be of the Shringara rasa. They're the more romantic rasa. And so that is incorporated into the Sama. The words are love poems, right? It's all pretty much love poetry. If you didn't know that it was Sufi poetry, you would think it was just secular romantic poetry. It's a context sort of that makes it sacred in that sense. And the you find these traditions of the uh, divine beloved, you find a lot of exchange between Hindu poets of the Bhakti movement as well here. So, for example, Mira's bhajans are also love poems to Krishna, right? And so uh, Chishtiya Sufism is developing at a time of the development of the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb.
Right.
And it is a time when Islam is changing because it is now present in India. Hinduism is changing through contact with Islam. Islam is changing through contact with Hinduism. And you have this sort of shared um, cultural traditions that begin to develop at this time. And so Qawwali
It
is a
became
product of that.
shared spirituality in some ways, you know.
Yes, yes.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and to this day, I mean, in our practice, you know, those lines of, obviously, those very crude, in my opinion, lines of, you know, religious divisions and traditions, they become blurred, and the sama becomes a merging of not only in the individual self with the divine and God, but also a certain merging of those who are present in the sama. You know, there's this sense of oneness. वो कहते हैं ना कि वो जो जब सुनने वाले भी होने चाहिए, तो वो you become at one with each other, and you become, and the entire audience becomes at one with God. And it's not just the person who is in a state of Vajd, but their state of Vajd is also a vehicle for everyone else to be part of that journey. So
Yeah, it's a positive feedback loop of energy in that space, right? It's not, in fact, if you're listening to qawwali with your headphones on, it's you may not achieve that state, but something about being in the space of the shrine with
Right.
people who are similarly feeling, if not in words, then at least feeling that softening of the ego through the music
Right.
and the beauty of the space and the music and the words. So it is, it's with all mystical traditions, the spiritual mystical traditions, the setting is important. The same setting, the same thing in a different setting results in a different result, right? So the setting is very important, and so it's not just about the music and the words, but also the context in which people show up to imbibe, right? People show up to participate in the sama with a certain intention to be present in a particular way. Yeah.
And it's
Mhm.
for everyone, everyone who is touched by a particular verse or a particular part of the rag, uh, is there is a permissiveness for everyone to be in that state as an individual and collectively, which I think is the beauty uh, of the summer setting, where there is intense freedom of the self. That platform creates the launching pad, so to speak, for the freedom of oneself towards the divine, and towards God, and that fana. So, um, uh, with that, Rachana, would you like to give us some closing comments? Next time, I was just going through my mind as you were talking, that the next
Mhm.
time perhaps we'll speak about the structure of sama and Kavali, and and
Mhm.
and how it evokes certain emotions, and puts one on that journey. So,
Sure.
um,
Final thoughts. Just that, I mean, what you said prior to, what you just said about kind of the inclusivity, the openness of this experience. Yeah, it is in a way, the mystical experience. Uh, and again, this is true of most religious traditions. Most religious traditions have mystical forms. That the mystical experience doesn't require a certificate or an identity card
yeah.
for you to have it. That the there's no notion that only these people who identify in this way, or only those people who identify in that way can reach this ecstatic state, right? It's not, yes, wajd is a concept within Sufism. It is it is a concept that has developed within the Islamic mystical tradition. But there's nothing that says that someone who isn't a Muslim can't experience wajd, right? So there's no gatekeeping in that sense. There's no place you have to swipe an ID card before you can experience wajd. The
The way
only
yeah.
the only qualification you need is, in a sense, uh, the openness to the experience, right? And even perhaps a desire for it, right? That the desire induces one to receive. And so it is that, so by its very nature, in that way, there is a potential it for these mystical experiences to speak across religious and cultural divides, because it doesn't require you to be X or Y to experience, right? That one's humanness is a basic qualification in that sense.
Correct. And that again takes us back to this idea of the oneness of God, right? So
Mhm.
where that connection with every single soul, no matter what state it is in, is every individual human being's right, and they all have the ability to get there. To me, which is a it flows from the idea of oneness of God, and hence all of humankind.
Yeah.
um, so I think, it's a very important part of these our practice, and particularly propelled by the setting of the summer, which we will speak about again,
Sure.
perhaps in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your enlightening us. Uh, Take care.
Thank
Khuda
you for having me. Khuda Hafiz.